The video game tutorial, a process or opening section of your game where you teach the player everything they need to know before letting them take on the rest of your game and putting that knowledge to use. Love them or loathe them, the tutorial serves an important purpose, and most games have them. But how do you do a tutorial well? What do you need to consider when making a tutorial? Should you explain every small aspect of your game in extreme detail right at the start with a manual's worth of text? Or do you leave everything a mystery and let the player explore with no real guidance? Do you explain features in-game or out of game? Do you lock the player away from making the wrong choice and force them down a linear path of correctness? Or do you offer suggestions for what might be the right thing to do while letting the player choose to ignore them and do their own thing if they want to? How do you teach a new player to enjoy your game the best? Every game has an onboarding process for new players, and some of them are more obvious than others. And if you're thinking, well, my favourite game didn't even have a tutorial, it was just really intuitive and easy to pick up and play, then your favourite game actually had the best type of tutorial, one you don't even realise you're playing. So let's examine the design philosophy of the tutorial, using some good examples, some bad examples, and ultimately discussing how you as a designer can provide the best onboarding process to your player to give them the confidence and skills they'll need to both enjoy and then beat the rest of the game. This is going to be an in-depth, complex video with examples from many games and breakdowns of how and why specific onboarding moments either do or do not work in the exact context of that specific game. I'm going to explain what I believe to be the four most important aspects of a tutorial, including immediately relevant information, stacking complexity of simple mechanics, narrative cohesion in the delivery of the tutorial, and smooth integration into the game itself. And then we'll look at the opening sections of several major games and critique them, including Dark Souls, Dead Space, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Portal, Morrowind, and Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. So grab a drink and settle in, because it's about to get pedantic. As usual, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. More information on how you can support at the end. For now, let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Josh Strife Hayes. I've got two main YouTube channels, Josh Strife Hayes, where I review MMORPG games, and Josh Strife Plays, where I review classic games. And on both of these channels, one of the design elements I focus on the most is the new player onboarding process. Now, MMORPG games can take hundreds if not thousands of hours to finish, if they can ever be considered finished at all, and classic games from the 90s onward can often be finished in under 20 hours. In the time it takes to completely finish Tomb Raider, you might not have even left the first zone in Guild Wars 1, so clearly the design philosophies in expected playtime are quite far apart. But one aspect remains the same in all of gaming. You will lose a new player unless the new player experience is good. It doesn't matter if your game is 5 hours, 50 or 500. The opening section is the most important for player retention. If the first hour isn't good, they won't make it to the second. If the second isn't good, they won't make it to the third, and so on. No matter how much you may insist it gets better, a new player wants it to be good now. The percentage of players who will finish your game or experience the end game content is very small. The percentage of players who will experience your game's opening is 100%. The opening of your game should be one of the best, most memorable, most playable, and most enjoyable bits. If you've ever talked to someone about your favourite game and they said, yeah, I just didn't get into it, it's often because the opening experience isn't as good as the final experience, and long-term players can sometimes forget how difficult or unintuitive a game's onboarding process can be. For every design choice that's obvious to you, it's a complete mystery to a new player. So while your immediate response to critique of a game's opening might be to say, oh yeah, you just do this, we need to think as designers and assume that a new player is alone and doesn't have your advice. They also don't know games that well. A good tutorial will get a brand new player up to speed and help them feel as competent as an experienced player relatively quickly. You'll notice I said as competent, not as powerful. A tutorial isn't about showering power on a new player and making them feel godlike. It's about allowing them to understand the situations and the systems they have control over. So a new player won't see an experienced player and be completely confused at what they're doing. They will completely understand what they are doing and be impressed with the complexity they're doing it with. So what must the opening of your game do to be considered good and give the players the skills they need to enjoy your game? I believe a good tutorial does 4 things very well, and a bad tutorial does those same 4 things very badly. A good tutorial does the following. 1. Explains the mechanical systems your game has, the agency the player has over them, and then lets the player practice in safety. and then use that mechanic to conquer a challenge related specifically to that mechanic. 2. Combines mechanical systems in stacking order to increase the complexity of future challenges. 3. Sets up the narrative delivery system the player can come to expect for the rest of the game. The tutorial information is delivered in the same way as the game's story. And 4. It does this within the game itself, not in a separate outside tutorial area. So it never feels like they're in a tutorial. The player always feels like they are playing the game. A bad tutorial simply inverts these rules. So a bad tutorial explains the mechanical systems but then does not let the player immediately use or interact with them. It does not combine the systems it has explained into more complex early game experiences. It delivers the tutorial information in a different narrative way to the rest of the game, making the tutorial feel separate or existing on a meta level above the game and not within it. And it does all this in a separate tutorial area, so you feel your progress in the tutorial isn't relevant to the rest of the game. You feel like you're studying and not playing. So let's take a look at these specifics before looking at a selection of games and analysing the tutorials within them and seeing how they comply to these 4 rules. Remember, a video game must assume the player has very little knowledge of other video games. You can't rely on another game having already taught your player what to do. One common talking point is read the manual, which is indeed a solution, but it doesn't always work. Relying on the manual is a way of covering for the lack of inbuilt tutorial, not enhancing it. Many modern games don't come with manuals, so I'm interested in the player getting everything they need from the gameplay experience itself. So let's break down those 4 areas. 1. Explaining the mechanical systems. You need to let the player know what they can or cannot do in your game, and how to do it. If they can walk, they need to be shown or told or encouraged to walk. Now you, as a long-time gamer, probably know just push the left analog stick forward or press the W key. But remember, we're building from the very foundation here. It's going to get more complicated. Once you've let the player know what they can do, you have the game itself set up a simple challenge where they need to do that thing. This could be as simple as walking forward, shooting a target, climbing a ledge, interacting with an NPC, or picking up an item. A good tutorial section will give you the mechanical information, explain its use, and then give you the ability to use it instantly in a safe environment, where using or not using it won't result in death. This could be, you can talk to people by pressing F, and there's someone there to talk to. The information given flows directly into the next player action. It doesn't need to do this fast. It's not about bombarding the player with choices. A bad tutorial will give you the information about the systems you do not currently have any reason or ability to use. Imagine starting a new game and being told, when you unlock the ability to fly, you can perform complex aerial combat, and yet you've not covered movement, jumping, flying, or combat, and you won't be able to fly for many hours. The player will forget that information by the time it's relevant to them, and you've broken the flow of your tutorial. The order you introduce the systems in should also flow from least complex to most complex. If one system requires the understanding of another, they must be introduced in the correct order. If most of your game is walking and climbing, then walking and climbing should come first. If your game has combat, but during combat you can also walk and climb, then you must introduce combat after the walking and climbing. If you have a mechanic or system in your game that will be important to the general flow of gameplay, or interact with multiple other mechanics and the player has the ability to interact with it, you should consider including that in the onboarding process early on in your gameplay experience. Because you want the player to see the mechanic and think, I know what that does, not have the player ignore it. If mechanic X is vital to game progression, the player must be exposed to and able to perform mechanic X early on in a safe place. Think of it as a pyramid with the foundation level mechanics on the bottom and the more niche situations which require multiple levels of foundation at the top. If you want to teach a player how to reload a gun, you first need to teach them how to pick the gun up, aim it, and shoot it, because reloading comes after doing those things. Once you've introduced a mechanic in this way, we move on to point 2. Combining the previously introduced mechanics with new ones and creating stacking challenges. Once you've told the player they can perform both action A and action B, you can put them into a situation where they need to use both A and B to succeed. If this is the first moment in your game where player actions are combined to work together, it can be helpful to mention this to the player, because a brand new player won't know the previous learned actions have synergy. But once you've taught the player, hey, things you're learning here combine, then you are free to present more complex puzzles and allow the player to combine all previous mechanical skills. For example, if your game is a third-person adventure and you teach a player they can jump, and then teach them they can climb up over a small wall, the combined action is having them jump to climb up over a small wall. Then you teach them to push boxes, and then you put the player into a situation where they need to push a box, jump onto it, and then jump and climb over a higher wall. But you do not specifically explain this process, instead allowing the player to combine their knowledge of individual previous mechanics to solve this new puzzle. Stacking simple mechanics together reinforces the player's understanding of the previous mechanics and helps them see how they can use them to overcome greater challenges. A bad tutorial would simply not combine the mechanics, instead having each explained in its own existence. You would explain the jump and have the player jump up something. Then you would explain a box and have them push a box. Then explain a dangerous surface and have them run around the dangerous surface. Presenting the mechanics your game has in simple standalone sequence isn't a fun playable experience. That's simply a gallery of what the designer has chosen to put in. If a player is only exposed to a single mechanic once, they will often forget it. And they also won't get to feel accomplished by using their gained knowledge almost immediately to overcome the next new obstacle. If you teach the player A and then B, when you introduce C, the player can have that moment of, hang on, I can use A and B to also impact C. Once you've stacked mechanics, you move on to step 3, setting up the narrative delivery system the player can come to expect within the context of the tutorial, and making sure the tutorial information is delivered in the same way as the game's story. Now this sounds complex, but it simply means present the early onboarding information in a similar way to how the rest of the game is presented, so the player doesn't feel like they're being given a tutorial, they feel like they're playing the game. If your game is mostly standing around talking, then have the tutorial delivered within the context of people standing around talking. If your game is delivered entirely through text boxes, then have the tutorial given through text boxes. If the tutorial information is given to the player in a vastly different narrative style to the general game, it makes the tutorial information feel omniscient. It makes it feel meta, like there's a layer of dry mechanical information above the game itself, and you must digest this before returning to the enjoyable part of the game. It feels very out of place within your game world, and it can break the pacing of your game. For example, if the opening section of your game is a fully voiced in-game interaction between your characters and you need to present the pick up an item with this button mechanic, you can have an NPC say that, because the use of voice is already established. You can even have an inconspicuous bit of reminder text in the corner of the screen for anyone playing on low volume. But if you have a fully voiced opening, then your tutorial begins and all the mechanical information is now given through giant text boxes which are not used in the rest of the game. You're delivering the tutorial information in a different narrative style, breaking the immersion of your opening section. Now, information doesn't need to be given through audio or text, it can also be visual. If your game is mostly about looking or exploring, then you can have the player see something. They can see something dangerous or see another character die, and they will now get the information that is dangerous. You can use lighting or the angles of your level to guide the viewer's sightline and say, hey, this is important, look at this. And moving on to the fourth, don't obviously separate your tutorial section from the start of your actual game. Your tutorial is the start of your game. It's not the bland setup, it is the opening. It is the first experience a new player will have, and it is the moment that will make the player decide whether they want to continue playing. If a tutorial starts in an obviously separate place, it sometimes feels disconnected to the real game, and this in itself can make the player feel their actions within the tutorial aren't important. It can also cause a player to forget certain mechanics when they're taken away from the context and safety of a tutorial. Indeed, even the word tutorial is so deeply ingrained in our collective gamer culture to mean irrelevant, boring training bit that people push away from tutorials without even playing them. They just assume they won't contain the same level of quality and mechanical depth as the actual game. How many of us know someone, or indeed are someone, who often says, no, don't do the tutorial, just put me straight into the game. People dislike the idea of tutorials because they feel fragmented, separate. They feel like a chore you have to slog through before you're rewarded with the game. But a good tutorial takes place within the opening of the game. For example, having the level names tutorial, then level 1 instantly puts the player into the this is an unimportant bit that doesn't matter mindset. But having level 1 followed by level 2, but designing level 1 to actually contain all of the mechanics, setups, combinations and narrative delivery you need to prepare the player, lets the player feel their actions matter from the very start. This is the essence of a hidden tutorial. So the 4 main principles of onboarding a player are: introduce mechanics within a safe place and have the player use them, combine multiple mechanics in stacking order to create complexity, deliver the information in a consistent narrative style, and have all this happen subtly within the main game. The ultimate goal of the hidden tutorial is to teach without the feeling of teaching, and for the player to learn and improve without realizing that's what's happening. When people say, "Oh, I hate it when a game holds my hand," they often mean they hate it when a game forces them into a linear path, preventing them from making mistakes, and demands they do something with no degree of freedom. This hand-holding design can actually be removed by a good hidden tutorial, because by helping the player understand what they can and cannot do quickly, you then don't need to hold their hand. They can be responsible for their own actions quicker. The difficulty in playing your game should come from using the skills they have, not understanding how the game works. So let's play through the opening sections of some of the most successful games. I'm going to play each game until it becomes obvious that the tutorial section has ended and the real game has begun, or until I feel the flow of information being given to the player has slowed to the point of, this is the game now, you are responsible. I will list everything the game has given me and say what we are looking for. I'm going to be super specific so you can see from a design point of view why the situations work or not based on the game's overall design. Let's start with one of my favourite games, Dark Souls 1. Intro cutscene. You're in a jail cell and somebody drops a body. No talking between you and them, so the theme of isolation and distance is established. You can't die in this cell. You can move with the left analog stick or WASD, but this isn't mentioned. You move to the body, interact with it and gain an item. This is shown by the button prompt. Then if you try the door, you will unlock it. Outside the door are messages on the floor in glowing orange, a visual highlight to draw the eye. Interacting with them lets us know we can move the camera, and already we have movement leading to interacting, leading to progression through a locked door, leading to a visual cue to interact with something which explains the controls. We're then told R1 and R2 attack, and right there you've got some docile enemies who will not attack you back, so you are safe. You are given information and can immediately use it. We're then told pressing the right analog stick in will lock on, and if you do that immediately after being told to do that, there is an enemy placed directly in front of you to guarantee the lock-on feature can show what it does right now. And then as a player, you realize you've just locked onto the same type of thing that you've killed in the corridor, so you can move toward it and attack. You weren't told to move toward or attack, but you know you can move and you know you can attack, and now the lock-on has added to that. Stacking mechanics. Climb up the ladder aided by a button prompt and then reach the bonfire. You are told to light the bonfire and then rest, and you are told while resting you are safe. Go through the giant doors in front of us because you've already interacted with a door, and there's an orange message on the floor, and we've grown to trust these orange messages, so we run toward it and a boss drops down. The message simply reads, "Get away," but offers no advice on how to do this. But we already know how to move both the character and the camera, how to run and how to attack. You can choose to fight, but you will likely die. And if you follow the advice and do indeed get away, you run through a door which closes behind you. Teaching the player running away is sometimes the best choice. You now see a bonfire which the player will instantly light and rest at because you know to do this, and now the game has enriched the feeling of player safety and the function of bonfires. You encountered one before a boss and immediately after. You as a player now know bonfires are spaced between difficult sections. The game hasn't told you this, it has let you play through this. The next orange message says "Get your shield," and a glance around the room shows this room is empty, but on the path outside you can see a bright shining item. The same shine the body had at the start with the key, so we know that is a visual cue to interact with something. However, there's an enemy shooting arrows at you, and with the item half inside an empty prison cell, the player is effectively encouraged to take cover within the cell, which leads to more orange messages, which explain how to open the menu and how to equip your shield. And once your shield is equipped and you leave the cell, the archer is still there, which is the perfect opportunity to use your shield. This is a perfect example of mechanic and then immediate use. Chase the archer and they run away, and you pass another item, a sword. Now the game doesn't say equip your sword because it doesn't have to. It's already explained how to equip a shield. So the player now just reuses that previous knowledge and makes themselves stronger. They'll chase the archer, most likely lock on, and then attack them, using all that previous knowledge. Another message explains about rolling and backstepping, and then a rather unexpected boulder rolls down the stairs at you, which, while dangerous, can be avoided by rolling. The skill just explained. teaching the player to be cautious when entering new areas. The boulder itself smashes into the wall behind you, teaching the player that backtracking and environmental destruction may open up new routes, and then Oscar is gloriously highlighted with the rays from the sun, a stark contrast from the hidden boulder. Talking to Oscar gets you the Estus flask, and another message now says you can use items by pressing square, which can be done immediately to drink from the flask. More messages explain kicking and jumping attacks and then two-handing your weapon, and this is followed by a more complex combat situation allowing you to use these choices if you want to. We're told about parrying and then immediately given an enemy that has more health to allow us to practice parrying and will sometimes parry us, so the player knows that enemies can do the same skills back to them. And then just before the boss room, you are told about plunging attacks. When falling, attack, and you can perform this instantly because the boss starts below you and do a large amount of damage to the boss. You then need to use the lock-on, rolling and attacking skills correctly to defeat the boss, and when the boss is dead, you leave the asylum. And only then do you realise this whole section is a tutorial, and that entire section is 15 minutes long. So let's see how Dark Souls 1 stacks up. Does it introduce a mechanic and let the player use it? Yes, you're told what your controls do and then almost immediately given a chance to do that exact thing. There are, however, a few important points that are missed, like jumping. Does it have stacking mechanics? Yes, you're shown how to move, interact, roll, run, block, parry and heal, and then given enough chances to do all of those things. The only issue is the boss itself cannot be parried, so having the parry training be directly before the boss can sometimes be a bit confusing. Does it have a consistent narrative style? Yes. Orange messages are the standard communication method in Dark Souls to other players, so using these to talk to the player through the game works. And 4, does this happen subtly within the main game? Kind of. The Asylum is a place you'll need to return to later, but having the player leave it via cutscene does create a very strong sense of, okay, now the real game begins, when you reach Lordran. But now look, when you rest at the bonfire, the menu is different. You've got level up, kindle and reverse hollowing, and those things have not been explained via gameplay. Many Dark Souls players don't know what kindling or reverse hollowing even does. Many people have completed the game without knowing what these things do. And beyond this, there's also weapon and armor upgrading, popping soul items for more souls, and jumping, which is never covered. So the tutorial isn't extensive, but it is a solid foundation. So Dark Souls 1 gives the player enough information to succeed, but leaves the more complex systems to be discovered, which actually matches the story themes of the game, exploration and discovery. It's a dense and effective tutorial. Now let's take a look at the opening of Deus Ex Human Revolution, a choice-filled first-person stealth shooter about human augmentation. The game starts in an office. You're not told how to move, but if you do approach the other NPC, you're told pressing E interacts via a proximity-based pop-up. You walk through an office on a preset path and get shown the Typhoon personal defense system blowing stuff up. This lets the player know what the Typhoon does. After 6 minutes of unskippable intro, you're told to use the lift and asked if you still know the code, to which you reply, yes, it's 0451. This is a nice integrated way of getting that information to the player and letting the player know what the character Adam Jensen knows. You hear some chatter on the radio, and then when you get into the lab that's under attack, this happens. Press tab for tutorial.
Before you can do anything, you must be able to get around. The first move you'll want to learn is the crouch.
That is disappointing. You've completely broken the flow of your story. You've established that characters can talk to the player via conversations, such as the lift code, and character to character via the radio. The story opening is designed to flow smoothly, to take us on the action-packed assault of a lab, and yet you completely break that flow by using immersion-killing meta-narrative videos from an omniscient third-party voice, which is unlike anything else in the game. Within the context of the game, a radio-based tutorial would have worked perfectly. When we reach this room, we get told we can do 3 things with objects: move them, throw objects at enemies, or use objects as cover. But you only need to do one of those things to advance: move. You can only do that right now, meaning the throw and use as cover bits have been mentioned but not been given a chance to be used, meaning you are now giving the player excess information they cannot act on. You'll actually forget that you can throw objects at enemies because in the moment it's mentioned to you, there is no reason to do it, so it never becomes a thing that you learn the value of. You will also never need to move objects in this opening section to use them as cover because cover is plentiful. So 2 of the 3 actions you've just introduced the player to will be immediately forgotten. Then we're caught by the powerful guy, thrown through the window and almost killed, but our partner throws a vat of acid over the enemy. This whole section has very little setup and the acid came out of nowhere, but we're focusing on the tutorial, not the narrative writing. Then there's a 6-month time jump and we have been rebuilt. We start in a lobby and our UI is glitching. Our eyes are augmented, so this makes sense and explains the reason we have a UI at all. We get it sorted out and then jump into a helicopter and sent on a mission. We're asked if we want to go in lethal or non-lethal and then short range or long range. Now player choice is great, but giving the player choice of how do you want to play before they've had a chance to experience both possibilities and form a fondness for one or the other means that you risk them missing out on their preferred playstyle. And when you start the mission, this is the inventory tutorial in full. Tell me if you think this is good.
At any point during the game, you can access the in-game menu. The inventory holds all the items you are carrying with you. It has a fixed size, which can be upgraded through augmentation. You can move inventory items around, examine them, or combine them with upgrades. In the heat of battle, you can rely on the quick inventory instead. It allows you to quickly equip a weapon, change grenade type, or use an item. Simply press the keyboard key associated with the slot in which the desired item resides. You can swap the content of a slot in and out as you please by accessing the inventory screen. The objective screen details your current missions and objectives. The log screen is a repository of all the emails and books you read on your journey. The map is a helpful tool that allows you to see where you are in relation to your objectives. Useful locations such as merchants and limb clinics are also marked. The augmentation trees are where you can spend experience points to upgrade augmentations you own. Simply select an augmentation and choose which upgrade you want to buy. Upgrading augmentations can be done anywhere, at any time.
You have just given the player an absolute load of information, the majority of which they cannot use right now. That is a 1.5 minute long video on a variety of systems you're expecting the player to remember that's not immediately important. You're not given the information at the correct time or in the correct context. These systems do not build on the previous. You can in the game also open lockers to find useful items, but you've not been told this. I know it's a very simple game mechanic to those of us who understand games, but it would be so much more simple to include back in the lobby a quick "Hey, can you open that cupboard and pass me that item" bit, which introduces a new player to the mechanic in a safe space, and then they'll know to do it in missions. More video tutorials about killing, stunning, moving, looting and hiding bodies, and then nutrients to refill our energy, and again, far too much information when you can only do one of those choices. And then we find a hacking terminal, and oh boy, this is the hacking tutorial.
When hacking, your goal is to take control of a device's registries, so you can access the security codes within. To do it, you must navigate the network, capturing nodes as you go along. You begin a hack from your point of entry in the system, the I/O port. To capture a node, simply place the cursor over it and hold the interaction button. A wheel will appear, showing you the programs that can be used against it. Traveling from node to node is accomplished using bridges. A bridge can be unidirectional or bidirectional, as shown by its arrows. Each time you capture a node, there is a chance the network will detect your presence. The higher a node's rating, the greater the likelihood that you will be detected. If detected, don't panic. You still have a chance, you just need to hurry. The network will try to trace your entry point and boot you out of the system. If you manage to capture the registries before the network trace reaches your I/O port, you'll be okay.
This is the reason why it's suggested to introduce a player to a mechanic in a safe space and allow them to get to grips with it without the fear of failure before you put them into the game where failure has a consequence. If you get this hack wrong, enemies will attack you. You haven't had training, you haven't been able to get to grips with doing this. Thankfully, the first hack is just an exact copy of the tutorial video, so you can just copy the moves. As the level progresses, you'll be faced with more computers you can hack, and while it's a great game in general, the introduction does not do a very good job of making you as a player feel competent and ready for the mission you are on. By the 1 hour mark, you have still not been introduced to augments or build paths, which is kind of the main selling point of this game. So after 1 hour of Deus Ex Human Revolution, we can evaluate the onboarding process. It does introduce mechanics to the player, but then it does not give them a chance to use them immediately. It often gives you information far before it's relevant, or gives you information that you cannot act on at this moment. It does, however, combine some mechanics into more complex puzzles, such as moving a box and then ducking into the vent that box was covering, or the stealth sections needing you to jump, crawl, climb and kill and then hide before progressing. Despite this complexity, it doesn't always feel like the player has actively chosen to do that, because you have put them into this situation before they feel confident and comfortable with the moveset at their disposal. You can also just run and shoot everything, so it's not really encouraging you or requiring you to explore the things the game does have. It also absolutely does not keep a consistent narrative style, breaking immersion and story flow to play long-form videos showing gameplay footage. These videos do not exist within the game world, and the characters are unaware of them, reminding the player that they're playing a game instead of living through a story, despite the fact we've already seen they know how to give the player information through the characters. And finally, is it hidden within the main game? While it does happen within the opening section of the game, and for story reasons you've got the pre-intro bit and the first mission bit, the first mission is essentially the tutorial, and it's very jarring to have the majority of the tutorial system delivered via in-game video. If you were a games designer, is this how you'd want the flow of your first mission to be? Let's jump genres now, from first-person detective to third-person horror, with one of the greatest horror games ever made, Dead Space. Play the first hour, break down the onboarding. Intro video. Notice how the NPC says a clean bill of health while the green piping fills up on Isaac's back. That's your health gauge, and it's just been referenced as health and shown as part of Isaac's character model, not a UI. In fact, Dead Space is designed to not have a functional UI at all. Everything in the game is entirely in-universe. Our small rescue ship crashes into the giant Ishimura and we take control of Isaac, a pop-up presented as a holographic display fitted within Isaac's suit, and a voice from the suit explains movement and how to run. And so we move off the ship and run after some NPCs. The NPC tells us to open a door, so we approach it and are prompted with the correct button to open doors. And then we're told about our locator system, which is an in-game storyline created from Isaac's suit guiding us to the next objective, activate a computer. So we turn on the security console and now watch one of the most brilliant openings in game history. The room we were in fills with necromorphs and our crew get ripped apart. You can't help, you can't do anything, you can only watch. But this is still teaching the player something. It's teaching us the intense power of the enemy, and then we are told to run. Now at this point, we only have a few skills: opening doors, running, and generating a map. So we combine those and run. And when you reach the lift, you interact quickly. The player knows how to open doors, but now it's tense because you're trying to do it faster. You're grasping the very small amount of knowledge you have of the mechanical systems and hoping it is enough to save you. We take the lift down to this room and see in writing on the wall, cut off their limbs. We approach the table, which is highlighted with this lovely stack of gore and light, and we grab the gun. We are told how to shoot, how to punch, and how to stamp. We are given the ability to do all three in this safe room. We stamp the boxes with an eye-catching light on them, get some items, and then shoot the door control to access the first enemy, and we can chop off their limbs by shooting the enemy's limbs. We're told about HP packs refilling our health and then given one on the floor directly next to us to pick up. We're then told about the map, we access the map and see exactly where we are in the ship, and now a lovely bit of design. You cannot get past this door because it's opening and closing too quickly, but there is a stasis module on the floor in front of you. Picking it up, as we know how to interact with objects, adds the gauge to the back of our suit, which we know is important information, and we get told shooting stasis slows things down. So now we use the new skill to slow down the door directly in front of us and go through it. And now everything combines. You need to move this broken tram car, but that means attaching both of these extending tram arms and then activating the main computer. But one of the arms retracts too quickly before you can run back to the computer. So you need to extend the arm, use stasis to slow the arm down, run back to the computer, and activate it. And while you are doing this, you will also be shooting the limbs off enemies, which means we've got movement, object interaction, stasis and object manipulation, and combat all combining into a single puzzle, and it's 10 minutes in. Finally, we find an object upgrade station. We get told we need an upgrade node, so we search the room, find a node, and upgrade our gun. So not only has it told us what we need, it's made sure we have access to it right now and then rewarded us for interacting with it. By now we are 30 minutes in, and you may feel scared, but you do not feel incompetent. We see an enemy crawl into a vent, teaching us avoid or at least be wary of the vents, and before we finish the first level, we're told about shops to buy or sell items, and that is the entire first level. So, Dead Space. Does it introduce mechanics, then let them be used? Yes. Movement, open doors, interact with PC, use stasis, shoot enemy, use stasis on objects. Everything is immediately used after being mentioned. Does it stack mechanics? Yes. The tram puzzle is literally, let's combine everything the player knows to create a more complex puzzle right now. Does it keep a consistent narrative style? Yes, everything is given to you, the player, as if it was being explained to Isaac through his suit, and it matches the holographic display used to talk to other NPCs. Also, having cut off their limbs, scrawled in blood, is excellent horror design. And 4, does the tutorial exist within the main game? Yes. You don't feel this is a tutorial, you feel it's the opening, and just as important. Indeed, the plot of Get the Tram Moving is extremely important because it allows access to the rest of the ship. I believe Dead Space is a shining example of how to onboard a player into your game and introduce mechanics consistently. But what about a game with almost no HUD, or in-game information, or NPCs, or even characters? How does Portal do it? Portal opens with you trapped in a room. You're told movement is WASD, space is jump, and the mouse looks around, so you're given the controls. You can move around this safe room, but the only thing to look at is the timer counting down. And when the timer reaches 0, the portal opens and you end up looking at yourself. And this is a brilliant bit of design because you've caught the player's attention, driven it toward looking at the clock. The portal opens directly below the clock, and then you've shown them that the portal doesn't take you somewhere random, they both exist within the same room and simply link 2 walls together because you can see where you are. You walk around the room to the only exit and step on a giant red button which opens a door. You can see the orange dotted line from the button to its effect, but stepping off the button closes the door. There's a cube, and as you approach it you're told press E to pick it up. So logically, you can now put 2 and 2 together and put the cube on the button, because you know the button's effect is what you want and the cube can be moved. Puzzle solved. The next room is actually literally exactly the same puzzle, puts the cube on the button, but with the portal mechanic added, but you don't control the portals. Notice how the walls are made of glass. This is so you can see what's happening and work out that the orange portal remains stable and the blue portal switches periodically. This colour choice is respected throughout. If the game needs to have a stable portal, it is always the orange one. It's effectively stacking the portal mechanic on top of the known put cube on button mechanic. The next room has a glass viewing window, and the only thing to look at is the portal gun on a spinning pedestal. The door is on a slow timer, so the player is encouraged to watch and understand how the gun works. And then when you reach the gun, there are some big arrows pointing toward it, encouraging you to pick it up, and when you get it, you only control one portal, the blue one. The orange remains fixed. The next room has you fall into a pit and you realise you can jump but not high enough, so you can't climb but you can portal. The next room has 2 cubes, one up on a ledge and the other down in a pit, and this is just so the player is taught that looking up or down will be important. Apart from that, it's exactly the same puzzle. And when we're in the glass ceiling room and we look up and we see this fixed portal on the ceiling above us, making a blue portal anywhere lets us see ourselves from above, teaching the player portals are not limited to vertical walls. You can place them on the ceiling and the floor if you want to, which is a design choice immediately relevant because the energy pellet room needs you to portal the ceiling, which is directly next. They've introduced the ceiling mechanic and then have you as a player use it. You're then shown how momentum affects movement through portals, or more correctly, how it does not. And then when you finally get the second part of the gun, the next puzzle needs you to carry a cube onto a button through various levels using momentum to climb higher. And now you're combining the last 3 mechanics together, and you've been playing about 30 minutes. Portal is a tutorial to itself. It introduces a mechanic and lets the player use it. Movements, cubes, buttons, portals, pellets, and later on, the turrets. Everything is shown, explained, and then immediately relevant. It then stacks all of its previous mechanics together to create complex puzzles. That is the entire design of Portal. It delivers all this information with narrative consistency, either having GLaDOS talk to you or having extremely limited HUD and non-intrusive button prompts combining with that voiceover, and then the visual cues showing a player what a system or mechanic is before allowing them to interact with it. And then it integrates it into the flow of gameplay, because the progression from chamber to chamber is the gameplay, and chamber 1, 2 or 3 feel no less important than chamber 10, 11 or 12. The process of playing Portal is a hidden tutorial in itself. But what about a game with quite a lot more going on? What about a classic RPG, like Morrowind? We begin on a ship. We're told to wake up and greeted by a guard, and then some on-screen text box tells us to move with WASD and look around with the mouse. Now remember, text boxes aren't bad. Text boxes are fine if the rest of the game is also delivered via text boxes. We're looking for narrative consistency. So we walk through the ship and open a hatch, and we are told, press spacebar to open the hatch, and we do just that. Then we're told, press spacebar to interact with an NPC, and we do just that. We're told, press spacebar to take the papers, and we do that. We now know how to interact with the world. And after we have created our stats, we learn about menus. We're told right-click to access the menu. But when you do right-click, you only have access to the stats menu because that's the only one you've created so far. And when we get given our first item, the item overlay is then added to the menu. Then we get sent to the next room and told to grab a dagger, open the menu, go to the item overlay and equip it. This is all shown in a safe space where we can't die. When you go outside, the map is added. The UI is becoming increasingly complex as you encounter stuff. We know how to go through doors, so we try and go through the next door, but the game says, hey, check the barrel. So we check the barrel and find a magical item, which teaches us not only check inside containers, but also allows the game to introduce the magic system and show how that works. We're told to go and find Cassius Cossidus in Balmorra, but advised to swing by this shop first. This is giving the player direction without railroading. And if you do visit the shop, you're encouraged to train up your combat skills on some bandits down by the river. The shop has better weapons than we currently have, but you don't have much gold, so you can't buy anything. The journey to Balmorra itself is essentially a long section where the skills look, move and read combine as you follow the signposts on a winding path. And when you do arrive, talking to NPCs and getting directions from them requires the use of the map, so the mechanics are indeed stacking. The main issue begins when Cassius recommends you join the Fighters Guild. And if you do, the first quest is to kill some rats, and if you try, you will die. Morrowind is a brutally unforgiving game in the early sections. The very first guild quest, Kill a Rat, is hard because you won't hit it and it will hit you. Now, we can consider this part of the onboarding process as it happens about 30 minutes into the game. This fight is the first actual fight you as a player get sent on, so it is essentially introducing a new mechanic, but it does not put you in a safe space to get to grips with it before needing to use it with potential life and death. But if you do listen to Cassius Cossidus' advice and go to the shop, buy some armour and a better weapon, and then take the rat on, you will still die, because Morrowind is a complete pile of jank. But you get the idea that it's trying to give the player some advantage. If a new player tries Morrowind now and says it's too hard, this is what they mean. The onboarding process has not given time for combat to be understood. It doesn't let the player become familiar with it before presenting an actual challenge. As for the rest of the tenets of the tutorial, it holds up quite well. It does introduce new mechanics slowly and then stack them together. Move, look, menus, maps, talk, navigation, combat. It does remain connected to the narrative by presenting this tutorial information in the same way as the rest of the game's text, and it does have this happen within the natural flow of the game, leaving the ship to Balmorra. It actually happens during character creation. But what about less RPG and more hack and slash? How does Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver on the PlayStation 1 hold up in the opening hour? You start off in a huge open room with no enemies, allowing you to get to grips with running around. There are no dangers and you have to follow a curvy path to get to a teleportation gate. This gate is explained to you by an omnipresent voice of the Ancient One. We're then introduced to green souls and told they are our health. Hold circle to feed. So you feed until you are full and then this door opens. We are prompted to press X to jump, and then we're given a small, medium and tall jump that allows you to see that Raziel can also scramble up to the top of the wall if the jump is almost high enough. We're then told to hold L1 and press X for a high jump, and then given an even higher wall to use that skill on. We're told about gliding and given a gap to glide over. All these mechanics have been immediately apparent and then stacked. We're now introduced to combat. Hold R1 to lock onto an enemy, press square to attack and X to dodge. When the enemy is defeated, they release a soul, which, as we know from earlier, we need to consume by pressing circle to feed. We're then introduced to the physical world switching mechanic and shown the grotesque differences between the spirit and the physical world, mainly how nothing in the spirit world can be moved, but in the physical it can, like opening doors, which again have a small button prompt. While in the physical world, we will constantly lose health, but we know how to refill it. Gain green souls. We're told enemies in the physical world can't be killed by wounds alone. We must use the environment, either spiked wall decorations, sunlight, or water. So we fight some enemies, and all of these hazards are available to us so we can choose and see what they all do. With no way out of this room, we approach a block and we are told we can move it. So we move the block over to a wall, which lets us jump onto the block and then jump higher to reach a ledge. So not only is the block moving mechanic introduced, it's introduced after combat and then combined with jumping. My main issue with this tutorial is how now the player is exposed to spears, but they are not mentioned. You can pick up weapons and throw them to impale enemies with them, but the tutorial misses this very important mechanic. We find a switch, flip it as we are told to, and the effect is dropping a bridge right next to us, meaning an instant and immediate payoff for interacting with the switch. And now there is a block pushing puzzle while combat is happening, which then needs a high jump to progress. 3 mechanics have just stacked, and we are 20 minutes in. We then get told about flipping blocks up ledges, and then another puzzle needing us to push a block into a pit, fight through enemies, then flip it up and jump along with it. 4 mechanics have now stacked together. And then another flip puzzle, except now the block receivers have symbols in them and the blocks have symbols on them. So we need to push this stack of 2 blocks apart, then flip the facing of the blocks using the flip technique, which is a perfect example of finding multiple ways to have a single mechanic interact with the world. Flipping blocks not only raises or lowers them vertically, it also allows you to flip them and their facing. And all of this puzzle actually loops us back round to push another block down to a previous area, which we can then flip onto another block to recreate the double stack from earlier, which gives us the height required to perform a high jump up to a new area. So analysing the opening hour of Soul Reaver, we can see the mechanics are indeed introduced simply. Walk, feed, jump, high jump, glide, fight, spectral shift, push block, flip block, and they are then immediately used in a safe place. Then they are all combined to create more complex puzzles which require use of all the previous mechanics combining with whatever new one has just been introduced. It's all delivered to the player by the old one, the same voice from the intro movie and our consistent omniscient guide, so the narrative delivery is consistent, and this is all done during Raziel's return from the underworld to his own clan, which means it takes place entirely in the main game world. Indeed, the player will return here multiple times as they gain more skills later and unlock extra hidden paths, so the tutorial area is actually a late game area as well. I think it goes without saying the opening of Soul Reaver is fantastically designed. So now we've looked at the onboarding process of 6 different games, the opening 15 to 60 minutes, and we've seen the strengths and weaknesses. So if you're a designer, please remember: 1. Introduce a new mechanic in a safe place and let the player use it at will. Then present a challenge that must be overcome using this mechanic. 2. Stack previous mechanics together into increasingly complex situations, giving the player the chance to see how everything they've previously learned works in harmony with what they're learning now, giving them that aha moment when they realise how things work together. 3. Present this information to them in the same way the rest of your game is presented, keeping audio, graphical, and narrative cohesion. And 4. Integrate this entire process into the opening of your game so it doesn't feel like a tutorial, but a natural opening. That way, when someone plays your game again, they won't think, oh, it's the tutorial bit. They'll think, oh great, I love the first level. Remember, the goal isn't to hold the player's hand as you force them to have fun. It's to make them aware of what they can do, give them a chance to do it, and then combine it until they eventually know everything. So the next time you play a new game, or return to an old favourite, pay attention to the opening section, see how it's built to guide you, and analyse why the onboarding process does or does not encourage you to keep playing? What games do you think have great tutorial sections, and which games do it badly? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Another massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You can support from only £1 a month. Check the video description for links to Patreon, Twitch, Twitter and Discord, and as always, have a great day.